Continuing our exploration into JavaScript, in this tutorial we are going to look at how we are able to modify CSS information through JavaScript and explore a couple of different techniques associated with that. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create my document. I'll choose HTML5 so I get a full complete document. I can hit tab a few times to get to the title. Now we will put in for our classes, and what I want to do is just put in some core content. So give myself a title in case I want to change that, and then I will put in a paragraph. And I will give this paragraph an ID, and we will call this P1. Next, we'll repeat the process. And once again, we will give it an ID. Now, technically with JavaScript, we could cycle through the paragraphs. We can access them as an array of elements and then grab each individual one if we so desired. Right now, we're going to use direct specificity. So that means we're giving these unique IDs. Now remember, classes can be applied to more than one element in your document, but an ID should only appear once. So IDs are used for unique single identifiers. Now, what I want to do is put in my script so that we can do something with this, and we can say let P1. Now, I like to repeat whatever the ID is. I like to set my variable to that as well, so it's easy to get the mental connection between those elements so that I'm able to keep track of those items. So now, this will be document query selector. Now, I'm using the kind of code completion, so I type Q and then I hit S, and then that gave me query selector. Now, my selector, I need to identify it, and because it's an ID, we use the same naming convention that we would use if this was CSS with it. So P2 will be document query selector, and we can see that it remembers the last thing I selected, so that was it. It allows me to be very efficient. Now if I just put in P2 like this, I will get an error because then this is looking for an element on my page called P2. If I just said P, it would grab the first paragraph that is here by default, so we need to identify it. Now if we want to access things that are of all the same class, then we could access it with a dot nomenclature the same way that we do when we have styles. We designate a style with a dot, an ID class we would use, or an ID element. When we put a style in it, we use the hashtag or pound sign. So now that I've done that, I have access to these. I want to be able to update them. With my document ready, what I'm going to do is just make a couple classes so that I have something to work with here. So I'll make a class and I'll call it red, and then we will put that into our and of course I do this, it seems, every single time. So I'll first put in my style tag and now move that up. You will notice I get the little color icon here that would allow me to choose a different color. That is using the extension color picker. So if you want to add that to your extensions, then that will give you the option of being able to then see the color or even choose the color as you are working with it. Now these are colors that are designated by name. So we can see how that automatically populates in. We can grab it off the list. So this gives us a good starting point. Now, what we can do is, technically, I could set up my item, and I could actually set the style directly on it. And we can specify what the color is, like this, in our script. Now, if we look here, we can see it did change that. I'm going to just add in an overarching style onto the body with it, and I just want to say font size to M, and then I also want to say font family. Notice I typed FOF, and now font family is highlighted, so I can hit return to select that. And I'll just go with sans serif because I just like how that looks a little bit better. And now these are bigger, so it's easier to see what is happening on screen. So I can assign my style property directly inside my JavaScript, but it's generally preferred to simply assign the CSS, and the CSS actually sets the individual CSS properties. And the easiest way is by attaching classes. So we add a class or subtract a class. We can attach multiple classes because an element can have as many classes attached to it as you want. That's the beauty of CSS, is we can stack those classes. And by using classes versus direct assignment, like what I did here, helps us to maintain separation of orders. So our HTML is concerned with our core document structure, our semantic presentation of the information, as well as the content that goes into that document structure. The JavaScript is going to then be concerned with manipulating the experience, and the CSS will have all of our presentation information. If we start putting the presentation, like putting styles directly in our HTML or specifying it directly here in the JavaScript, we're starting to mix those up a little bit. And in a small project, it's not a big deal, but when you start to look at a project under a scope of having 1,000 or 10,000 documents, then that could be an issue if you do not keep things separate and organized. So the next thing that we're going to do is start assigning some classes, and I'm going to add a few more classes in to this, and we will see the classes because we can see my document elements. I've put those on the side over here. I don't have the console up where it will show me information that's happening with JavaScript, but I can see my core document present. So with that, I'm going to just create a few more classes so I have some things to work with, so we can add and subtract and make a mess out of everything as we go. Now I'll put in background color. My background color I'll just put in blue, and then I want to put in, even though I set the font family to sans serif there, I'm going to actually make it so that I can customize it a little bit here. And this will be my font family serif. And then font sans. And this time it will be font family of sans serif. And finally, I want to create two more classes. And these are ones that we'll be using extensively on our next large project going forward. So I do want to introduce those here. And this is where we can set the display property of an element. Now, we'll be using this because we want to control which elements we are seeing and which elements we are not seeing. And we have different ways of going about it. We can set display, we can set opacity. But what's nice about display is it removes that element from the document flow. So it doesn't just leave a hole there where we make it go invisible, but it maintains its place. It completely will go away. And we'll look at that as we start implementing that with deliberate functionality in subsequent projects. So with this, I can just simply start playing with this. I'll go p1.className, and let's just set our class name to red, and let's see what it looks like. If I look here, we can see where it says class red, style color purple. We can see that the purple is overriding the red because the purple is now, think of CSS as the thing that is closest to an element affects it the most. So we have the purple overriding the red because purple is happening directly in the code where red is happening in the CSS. So it's overriding it. Right now I'm going to just get rid of that so we can actually start to see our change happening. We can see now class of red has been assigned. But if I look here, there is no class of red assigned to this element. So I didn't hard code class of red in there. When I could even go in here and go class aqua like this, and we can now see class of aqua is there that has been assigned. But if I were to go through and go p2.className is equal to aqua. And it's also important to remember that classes, when they're defined in CSS, when we're using query selector, we would use the dot on it. But when we're setting its property here, we don't do that. So now we can see P2's class name is changed to, oh, well, P2's was aqua. Let's go red. And now we can see absolutely nothing happening because I put a 1 there and not a 2. Whoops, let's try again. And now we can see it's both red. So if I look in the HTML, the class is aqua. The JavaScript is making it go to red. Now, notice we're saying class name. We have another thing that we can do where I can go p2.classList. And class list, we can add a class, and let's add in blue. Now we can see that the class is red-blue. If I look here, it's red-blue. So we've made this aqua go away. So one thing that happens when we have class list, well, let's even play with it some more and then we'll see what happens. Class list, add, whoops, that was a bad typo, and let's go font serif, like this. So now we can see it's red-blue font serif. We can see it's now a serif font instead of the sans serif font. But if I were to go and say p2.className and set the class name equal to font sans, oh, need some quotes there. Now save this. All those other classes disappeared because class name will set it equal to one single class. Class list allows me to add or subtract from that list. So I can also go p2.classList, well, list.remove blue. Gotta remember the quotes there, blue. So before I put that in, I'm going to save this. So we can see it's red-blue font serif is what it is. Red-blue font serif. Now if I uncomment that, remove blue, we'll see blue right here disappear off the list when I save it. So red font serif, and of course it's red and it's serifed. So I'm hoping that you're starting to see that we have a lot of flexibility here. Class name obliterates whatever classes were there and replaces it with what you specify. Class list will add or remove from whatever classes have been assigned to a given element. So now if I were to go p1 dot class name equal to display none. So now I save this. See, there's P1, there's P2, it's still there. Notice, and it's still there. And it's still there because my fat fingers missed a letter. Save it now. Display none and display none. Notice how the second paragraph has indeed gone up. Now if we don't want to get rid of that. Well, actually I'm going to leave that out. Get rid of this. Now we save. We can see red, blue. So notice how far down this is. But if I now have display none attached to it, it slides up because the other item, as far as display properties are concerned, is gone. But if we look in the code, we can see it is indeed still there. It's just not being displayed. Now to continue looking at this a little bit, we'll see that if I did a quick search for how to change CSS properties with JS, and it brought me to Stack Overflow. We saw a great example of element style, the property you're changing, and what value you want it to be. The key thing is notice that items in where it would be hyphenated, 2 words, background color, when we reference it in the JavaScript, as it says here, it becomes camel cased. So that's one thing to pay attention to. Now something else is I looked up className on MDN and looked up classList. So these links will be in the comments to the video. You can look at them and read about them in a little bit more detail to understand how they function, how we can use className, how we can use classList, or this Stack Overflow question on doing it. So reference the links in the description below.